We're going to be looking at the economics of discrimination. This is the first of several lectures I'm going to be preparing on the topic. Just want to introduce you to what the topic is going to look like. Today's been kind of one of those informal, work days. I've decided to be comfortable, put on my Ohio Wesleyan sweatshirt. So let's see what we can learn today about discrimination. If we talk about discrimination, at least in terms of labor economics, we can look at various measures of labor market success. And, we can look at it for different groups. It doesn't necessarily prove discrimination, but as they say in law, this is prima facie. This is just the first glance at the evidence that will begin to tell us where we might look. So here are four different ways we might be able to talk about discrimination between various groups. We could, look at the earnings, compare earnings of different groups. We could, look at measures such as employment and unemployment. We could look at what occupations people occupy. Because remember, we talked about compensating wage differentials. If some jobs are more unpleasant, even if the earnings and the employment prospects are the same, that too could be a way of looking at discrimination. And finally, even though it's not the labor market exactly, the acquisition of human capital. This is what we call discrimination pre-market, before you enter the labor market, where there are differences in the ability of different groups to obtain human capital. So, let's start by looking at earnings by gender. Once again, one of the things I keep on emphasizing is don't memorize the numbers, but look at what is the story that the numbers tell you. So I was able to get some data from the Women's Policy Research Institute. As you can see, it goes through 2018. People working full-time, what is the ratio of women's earnings compared to men's? What's the percent of women's earnings compared to men? And what you can see is over the decades, this has steadily increased. One way of looking at this is the fact that the gap is narrowing. So over approximately the last 50 years or so, about half of the difference in the weekly earnings of men and women, half the gap has been closed. The gap was about 38%, now it's about 19%. There are certainly differences in earnings in the United States by race. This is for people that are 25 years of age and older. Well, what do we see? Actually, it turns out Asian Americans earn more than white Americans. But if we look at black Americans, there certainly is a gap. We can see the gap is somewhere on the order of about 20%. Now, we haven't done any statistical analysis. There's no correction, for years of education or anything like that. But we see there's a gap in the earnings of blacks and whites in the United States. Now, the way the census and the current population survey asks people about Hispanic status, it's totally separate from race. One can be white and Hispanic. You can think of somebody, for example, if you ever watched I Love Lucy, Desi Arnaz, her husband, or you can, think of, famous singers, Enrique Iglesias. I have no idea who's big now, but, various, singers. Well, I forgot the name of the gal that performed at the Super Bowl from Colombia, but you can be white and Hispanic. On the other hand, if you're a baseball fan, David Ortiz was from the Dominican Republic, and he was black. So Hispanic is a totally separate thing. You can be Hispanic in any one of these groups. And what you see is Hispanics earn less than blacks. So we see there's a difference in earnings between the genders, a difference in earnings between races. What about employment and unemployment? Well, once again, we see that whites and Asians both fare better than the other groups. Blacks have a lower percent employed. This is for adults. This is the current data. By the way, these numbers are going to get worse when the April figures come out a week from Friday. And we can also see the unemployment rate for blacks is higher. Many people that are Hispanic have immigrated to the United States. They've come to work. So actually the employment to population ratio is higher for this group, and the unemployment rate is also higher. More of them are seeking work, and not all of them are finding it, so there's unemployment. When I was an undergraduate back in the dark ages, as a rule of thumb, we used to guesstimate that about the black unemployment rate was usually twice that of the whites. It's not quite twice that now, but it's not that far off. So blacks have historically had higher unemployment rates than whites in the United States. We can look at the occupations that various groups have. There's an important takeaway here. 47% of the workers in the American labor force are women. What we find out, I gathered some data, this is from last year. What we find out, these are the fields that employ the most women. And the takeaway is, look at how many of these fields that employ women are at least 80%, or 80% of the people that are working in those jobs are women. People sometimes refer to this as the pink-collar ghetto. The idea of a white-collar job is a job that is one in an office. The idea of a blue-collar job is one where you're working in manufacturing. But a job that's heavily female, sometimes people call it the pink collar. So you'll notice elementary school teachers, registered nurses, teaching assistants, social workers, preschool teachers, licensed practical nurses. A lot of the helping professions are ones that employ the most women. There's probably about 100, or actually it's about 400 different occupations, and these are just the top 11 or so. But about half of these occupations are 80% women. Women tend to work in occupations that are heavy employers of women, much more so than men. They're concentrated in fewer occupations. If we look at the occupations by racial group, I was able to find this chart. What we find out is whites are more likely than blacks or Hispanics to work in management. Asians are even higher. And if you look in the jobs like we read about in Cut Loose, production, that's factories, transportation, and moving material, what we find out is that there's more blacks in those jobs, more Hispanics as well. You can also see Asians are less likely to be in sales. So there's a difference in terms of gender and race in the occupations that people have. Now, remember, women earn less, it should be less than men. I can never make a slideshow without making at least one typo. Okay. If we look at this, male is the darker red, female is the pink. What do we find? High school completion. Both in 2000 and 2018, women were more likely to have a high school degree. Women were more likely to have an associate's degree or higher. That's a degree associates you get at a 2-year college. If you look at bachelor's degrees, women are more likely to have a bachelor's degree in the United States. And if you look at master's degree or higher, the same thing with women. Women earn less than men, but women have more education than men. Okay. And, finally, if we want to look at some differences, in education, what we notice here is if you want to look bachelor's degree or higher, whites, it's a little over 40%. Asians, wow, it's over 60%, but it's much higher than the Hispanic or blacks with degrees. So when we saw earlier some of the problems in terms of earnings and problems in terms of employment, unemployment, part of it is due to the acquisition of human capital. It's kind of interesting to note less than a high school diploma. You actually find out that Hispanics, it's quite high. It's about a quarter. And this is a little bit surprising at first. Whites are more likely to lack a high school diploma than blacks. How can that be? The answer, remember what I said before, Hispanics can be any race. Asian, black, white, they can be American Indian. I've even met a few. So, since most Hispanics are white, the fact that there's so many Hispanics without a high school degree, that's why it's actually a little bit higher for whites. But anyway, we see one of the problems that blacks have in terms of the labor market is less human capital coming in. Pre-market, before they get to the labor market, differences in human capital. Okay, so what are the key points? What is it I want you to take away from today's class? One of the things is, can differences in human capital explain women's earnings being less than men? No. Women have more education than men, yet earn less than men. Women are concentrated in fewer occupations. Some of these, as you will notice, were caring occupations: a teacher, a nurse, a social worker. Maybe these are jobs that appeal to women. That's beyond my area of expertise. Maybe some of these are jobs that give greater flexibility. Let me, what's the old joke? What are the 3 best things about being a teacher? June, July, and August. So if you're a teacher and your kids are in school, you'll have time off the same time they do. Sometimes for some people that's actually something they don't want, but for most people it's something I love being with my kids. So, but women are concentrated in fewer occupations, and a lot of those are helping ones. There's a feedback effect. If women see that women go into certain occupations, those are the ones they might choose to go into. I was reading a research study, and what it noted was that when women students have a female professor in economics, they're more likely to major in economics. So a role model can have an effect. If you don't have many people in that job, then you might find out that people aren't going to think they can go into that. And if you look at the earnings gap between men and women, it increases with age. A woman with a college degree earns slightly less than a man with a college degree. But that gap can widen to about 40% by the time that they're in their prime earning years. Maybe women take time off to have children. Experience is part of human capital. Maybe they take jobs that offer greater flexibility. Since they're going to be taking time off, if they do, for having children, then the result is maybe they don't get as much firm-specific training, but the gap widens. If we look at blacks and whites, I would say the key thing I want you to take away is that there's a difference in human capital before you even enter the labor market. Part of the problem is differences in human capital. You can't blame it all on the labor market because people don't start the race in the labor market from the same point. An economist I think very highly of, Ronald Oaxaca, did a study, and he said, well, what if we looked at the difference in blacks and whites earnings, and what if we did a statistical analysis and gave blacks the same level of education as whites? Suppose we corrected for that. Well, that would eliminate about 40% of the difference. Above and beyond any differences in the educational levels of blacks and whites and Asians, there still is something going on. So, next time, what I want to do in the next lecture is talk to you about theories of discrimination. Economists have come up with some pretty good ideas. I want to explore that in the next video. And, following that, what I want to talk to you about is, what does the law say? And what is the court's interpretation? I'll bet there's some things I'm going to teach you in some of the lectures upcoming that you didn't know. I think that's what they pay me for. Take care. Stay well.